Welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is our deep dive, where we take the core research, the dense institutional reports, and try to deliver the essential architecture of understanding straight to you. Today, we're looking at a really crucial case study in economic statecraft, especially under the most intense duress imaginable. Our subject is the effort to stabilize and strengthen the value of the Ukrainian hryvnia, the UAH, right in the middle of these immense wartime economic pressures.
And we really have to look past the day-to-day noise of the exchange rate.
Yeah.
The sources we've gone through, they offer a clear, very methodical framework. It's not about short-term fixes. It's about the sequencing, the policies, and the very real constraints involved in building genuine, sustainable currency strength when a nation's very existence is on the line.
Our mission, then, is to really extract those mechanisms. We need to analyze the constraints imposed by the war and really detail the non-negotiable order of operations, let's say, that's required to rebuild trust.
Right. And to understand the difference between, a temporary number on a screen that might be hiding instability versus establishing true, long-term, real economic value.
That distinction, that's exactly where we need to start, because when we talk about strengthening the hryvnia, there are really two separate things we're looking at. You have the nominal value on one hand and the real value on the other. So the nominal value, that's just the price tag, right? It's how many hryvnias it takes to buy $1, the number you see on the news.
Exactly. It's the headline number. And that's often the focus of political attention because, it's a number. Politicians feel they can control, or at least try to, with administrative tools.
They can just fix it.
They can fix it. They can manipulate it in the short term. And that can give a sort of false sense of security. But the real value, that's the true reflection of a currency's health. It speaks to the long-term well-being of the people.
So the real value is more about purchasing power, what the currency can actually buy once you account for inflation at home and abroad.
Precisely. It measures what your hryvnia can actually buy inside Ukraine compared to what it could get you overseas. If the nominal rate is fixed, but your domestic inflation is running at, say, 20%.
You're getting poorer.
You're getting poorer in real terms. Your savings are being quietly, stolen. Long-term prosperity and competitiveness, they depend entirely on that real value. We have to look for genuine economic strength, rooted in things like productivity and low inflation, not just an administrative number propping up a fragile front.
Okay, so let's set the scene. Let's go back to the moment of trauma. The 2022 full-scale invasion.
It was a massive shock.
An almost fatal shock to the Ukrainian economy. I mean, you saw this precipitous drop in output, commercial activity just stopped, millions of people were displaced, and infrastructure was being destroyed on a scale Europe hasn't seen in generations.
And the state became instantly reliant on external aid just to perform its basic functions. Paying pensions, paying soldiers, the whole financial system was staring into the abyss.
The word trauma is right. The immediate need wasn't for, long-term strategic planning. It was triage.
It was crisis containment, just stopping the bleeding, economically speaking. If you look at what happened, you had households, firms, banks, all facing this unheard of uncertainty. There was a run on deposits, a massive, immediate rush for foreign currency. All the normal anchors were gone.
So the National Bank of Ukraine, the NBU, they had to step in with what the sources call a tourniquet.
A tourniquet, exactly. Something to prevent a total collapse of the financial system and the currency.
And they did three things at once, really. Three primary actions that formed this tourniquet. They were necessary, but very distortionary. Let's start with the most visible one, fixing the exchange rate, the emergency peg.
Fixing the hryvnia to the U.S. dollar, that was a critical psychological and economic move.
How so?
Well, think about it. The market had lost all its bearings. Trading volumes vanished. Nobody knew what to expect. This peg, it instantly provided a clear, non-negotiable nominal reference point.
So it just told everyone, this is what a dollar costs, period.
Yes. And by anchoring that one single price, it allowed businesses and banks to start functioning again, even under this extreme pressure. It gave them a baseline for pricing contracts, for valuing what was on their books. Without that anchor, the panic would have just fed on itself. You'd be looking at hyperinflationary expectations very, very quickly.
So it wasn't just about the currency. It was about providing a mental benchmark for the entire economy when everything was chaos. But a fixed rate like that, it's not sustainable on its own. You need the second measure, strict foreign exchange controls.
Right. The FX controls were the dam that made the fixed rate possible.
What do you mean by that?
When an invasion starts, The most rational thing for any person or company to do is to get their money out of the local currency and into something stable, like dollars or euros.
Capital flight.
Massive capital flight. So these strict administrative limits, limiting how much you can withdraw, banning certain sales of foreign currency, requiring permissions for cross-border transfers, they physically stopped that massive outflow.
So you're trapping the money inside the country?
You're ensuring that the NBU's scarce foreign currency reserves stay in the domestic economy. That prevents the rapid drain that would have made defending that fixed peg completely impossible.
It's the difference between clubbing a small leak and trying to hold back a tidal wave. The controls were the only way to stop the wave, but they also had to signal strength, which brings us to the third action, sharply tightening monetary policy.
This was vital for credibility. Tightening here means they dramatically raised real interest rates. The NBU eventually hiked its main policy rate by a huge amount.
And what did that do? What was the purpose of that?
It served two purposes, really. First, it was a clear, aggressive signal that they were committed to fighting inflation expectations right from the start. If they'd kept rates low, people would have just borrowed cheap local currency and immediately tried to convert it into foreign currency.
Which would have just accelerated the capital flight and the inflation.
Exactly. And the second purpose. The high rates were a form of compensation. They offered a very substantial return on domestic assets, things like government bonds or even just bank deposits, to offset the huge risks.
The risk of inflation and the risk of holding assets in a war zone?
Right. It was a calculated move to make holding the hryvnia, despite all the danger, financially worthwhile compared to trying to get your assets out of the country.
So this combination, the administrative peg, the FX limits, and the aggressive monetary signaling, this is all captured by that analogy of the tourniquet.
It's the perfect analogy, because a tourniquet, it stops the massive immediate bleeding of capital flight and currency collapse. It saves the patient's life in the short term.
Okay.
But the sources are crystal clear on this. It is not a sustainable long-term solution. A tourniquet, left on too long, restricts circulation and causes its own damage. Restricting the free movement of capital, fixing a price administratively, it creates distortions, it encourages black markets, and it's incredibly costly to defend over time. These crisis measures are, by their very nature, temporary.
So they bought time. They stopped the spiral. But you can't rely on a tourniquet forever, or the underlying economic tissue starts to die. So the next phase has to be about shifting from pure survival to building a genuine foundation of confidence.
And that takes us out of crisis management and into the very hard work of macroeconomic stabilization.
Okay, so stabilization. This is the first essential pillar. It's the non-negotiable precondition for any kind of lasting currency strength.
It's not optional. Without this phase, any other reform you try to build is just, well, it's built on sand. If your domestic deficits and inflation are out of control, the currency is just constantly being eaten away, no matter what the government says.
Let's break this down into its three core parts. We can start with the first goal, price stability, or what the sources call monetary discipline. We've mentioned inflation, but why is chronic inflation so damaging, not just economically but politically, for a currency like the hryvnia?
Chronic inflation is it's insidious. Economically, it's destructive because it just shreds confidence in the local currency as a store of value. It's a slow, ongoing theft of purchasing power.
And it penalizes savers.
It penalizes savers, people on fixed incomes. It hits the most vulnerable in society the hardest. And when people expect inflation to be high and volatile, they react rationally. They abandon the local currency. They rush to dollars, to gold, to real estate, anything to protect their savings.
And that's the dollarization we hear about.
Yes, and that process, that dollarization, just accelerates the problem. It drives rapid depreciation and makes the whole financial system unstable.
So the central bank's role, then, is to be the primary anchor for everyone's expectations. How does the NBU do that, and what's the big political trap they have to avoid?
Well, the NBU has to show that it's completely independent politically. It needs to have a sustained, credible commitment to tightening policy. This means the politicians can't be telling them what to do with interest rates. The NBU has to manage liquidity aggressively and keep real interest rates high, so the return has to be positive after inflation.
That prevents temporary shocks, like a factory getting hit, from turning into a persistent, economy-wide inflation spiral.
Exactly. And that political trap you mentioned is the critical constraint here. It's avoiding something called fiscal dominance. This is a key concept. It's where fiscal needs just completely overwhelm monetary policy.
Can you elaborate on that? Because it seems like the core conflict.
A fiscal dominance is, it's like the original fin in this kind of economic scenario. It's what happens when the government, which is facing these massive, unavoidable wartime deficits, I mean, they have to buy bullets, pay soldiers, keep basic services running, starts to pressure the central bank to become its piggy bank.
They force the central bank to print money.
In simple terms, yes. They source the central bank to monetize the deficit. The central bank buys government bonds directly from the Treasury, which is the same as creating new money out of thin air to pay the government's bills.
And no matter how independent the NBU claims to be or what interest rate it says it's setting, if it's forced to do that, the currency is just doomed.
It's doomed. The supply of money explodes. It floods the system. You can't be trying to cool the room with the air conditioner if you're also setting a bonfire in the middle of it. The sources are very clear. If the central bank becomes just a tool of the finance ministry, it loses all credibility, all control over inflation, and it negates every other effort.
So avoiding that requires real political courage from the government to find other ways to fund the war. And that leads us right to the second pillar, fiscal responsibility, managing that war deficit.
A wartime deficit is a grim necessity, but how it's funded is the defining factor for the hryvnia's stability.
So what does sustainable financing actually look like in a war zone?
It has to be non-inflationary financing. The state absolutely cannot finance the bulk of its huge defense and social spending by just printing money. And it also can't do it by issuing so much domestic debt that it crowds out all private borrowing.
So where does the money come from?
This means relying very heavily on grants and concessional loans from international partners.
Grants are straightforward, they're basically gifts. But what about concessional loans? How are they different from normal borrowing?
They're loans with highly favorable terms, very low interest rates, very long repayment periods. This is fundamentally different from going to the commercial market for debt.
And that distinction is vital.
It's vital for long-term health. Commercial debt, especially during a war, would be incredibly expensive because of the risk. And it just creates a huge repayment problem down the road. Using grants and concessional financing, even with strings attached, ensures that you're fighting the war today without destroying the currency's future solvency. That international support is a direct subsidy to the hryvnia's stability.
But it can't all be external help. The sources also talk about the need for domestic discipline, even during a war. What kind of actions are we talking about?
The government has to signal its own long-term financial sobriety. This means taking difficult steps at home. It means broadening the tax base fighting evasion, making sure everyone who can pay does pay. And critically, it means strictly prioritizing spending.
Cutting out the waste.
Ruthlessly. Any wasteful or poorly targeted spending has to go. You have to ensure every single hryvnia is being used efficiently for the war effort and for essential social services. This sends a crucial signal to your own citizens and to international partners that you're managing your house responsibly, even under all this pressure.
The analogy of a household in a medical emergency really fits here. You need help from family or charity. The grants, that's responsible. You don't just max out all your high-interest credit cards.
Right, because that would ruin your reputation and your future financial standing. And that idea of reputation and future standing, that's the perfect bridge to our third and final pillar of stabilization, debt sustainability.
Okay, so if the market starts to believe that the total debt load is just unsustainable, what does that do to the currency right now?
The perception alone is devastating. It creates this almost existential crisis of trust.
Because investors start to anticipate a default.
They anticipate one of two painful outcomes. One is an outright hard default on the debt. The other, which is often the preferred political path, is a soft default, just inflating the debt away, deliberately weakening the currency's purchasing power so the real value of what you owe shrinks.
And knowing that's a possibility, investors demand a huge risk premium to hold your assets.
A very high risk premium. Immediately, it makes all your domestic assets, your bonds, your stocks, look incredibly unattractive compared to safer foreign assets. Why would I hold a hryvnia bond if I think it's going to be inflated away?
So you need a clear, coherent strategy for managing all these obligations.
You absolutely do. And this is where that international engagement becomes so structural. It means doing things like negotiating a restructuring of your existing debt, trying to extend maturities so payments are pushed far into the future, and crucially, setting clear, verifiable, medium-term debt targets.
And these are often anchored by an IMF program.
Yes, an IMF program provides the framework and the monitoring. That kind of commitment dramatically reduces the perceived risk of default. It lowers that risk premium investors demand, and that directly supports the hryvnia's value by making domestic assets a safer, more viable thing to hold for the long term.
Which brings us back to the power of that external reinforcement. The IMF, the allies, they aren't just giving cash, they're providing an external anchor through conditionality.
Conditionality is often a politically unpopular word, but economically in this situation, it's a lifeline.
It's the mechanism that enforces the discipline.
Right. It means that to get the grants and the loans, the nation has to meet agreed-upon milestones for monetary and fiscal management. This external framework reinforces the domestic promises and acts as a powerful brake against political pressure to, just turn on the printing presses or delay painful cuts. Without that external oversight, the pressure to abandon discipline in a war would be almost impossible to resist.
Okay, so we've established that macroeconomic stabilization, that's phase one. It stops the collapse, it stops the bleeding, it sets the table. But to actually increase the currency's real long-term value, the economy itself has to get better. It has to become more efficient, more trustworthy.
And that means moving into the politically very difficult work of phase two, structural reforms. We're moving from stopping the loss of blood to actually building muscle.
This is where the real political friction starts, isn't it? Because this changes who holds economic power. Stabilization with high interest rates is a general pain that affects everyone, but this is targeted.
Yes. Governance and structural cleanup, they target specific, powerful actors.
Why is this second phase so much harder politically than just managing interest rates? I mean, things like cleaning up the judicial system, state-owned enterprises, customs.
Because structural reform directly disrupts entrenched interests and patronage networks. You're talking about powerful groups, often oligarchic structures or corrupt officials, who actually benefit from the current dysfunction.
They profit from the chaos.
They profit from it. They extract what economists call rents from the system. Cleaning up customs, for example, eliminates the money they make from smuggling. Reforming the judiciary eliminates their ability to buy court decisions to protect their assets. You're threatening their income stream.
So these actors are well organized, they have money, and they can mobilize serious political opposition to block these changes.
Exactly. It becomes a pitched battle. You're asking the government to fight a war on the front line and at the same time fight its most powerful domestic financial interests. That is the fundamental challenge of phase two.
Let's break down the specific levers here that are needed to build this real value. Starting with lever A, institutional quality. The sources call weak institutions a kind of governance tax.
It's a tax. It's a tax that every single investor, whether they're from Ukraine or from abroad, has to pay just to operate in that environment. They demand a higher expected return, that risk premium we talked about, because they have to price in non-economic risks.
What kind of risks?
The risk that the government might just decide to expropriate their property, or that they'll face arbitrary regulatory changes that wipe out their business model, or, maybe most critically, that their contracts will be worthless because of corrupt court decisions. This systemic fear is baked into the price of the hryvnia and the cost of all capital in the country.
So things like strengthening the rule of law, protecting property rights, fighting corruption, these aren't just, good governance talking points. They're critical economic tools.
They're absolutely essential. Reducing this governance tax makes long-term planning possible. If an investor trusts that a contract signed today will still be valid in 5 years, they'll invest in a factory that takes 2 years to build. Without that certainty, they only make short-term liquid bets they can pull out quickly.
And this is why EU integration is mentioned as such a powerful force here.
Aligning with the EU acquis, the body of common European law, is so much more than just a bureaucratic exercise. It's a massive institutional upgrade. It forces the adoption of external, internationally recognized standards of governance and regulation.
It signals stability.
It signals stability and regulatory convergence. It lowers the perceived risk dramatically because it provides this external, rules-based anchor that's very difficult for domestic entrenched interests to get around. It effectively lowers that governance tax for everyone.
Let's move to lever B, productivity and exports. This is the real engine, where the currency's strength gets rooted in actual output. The source talks about something called the Balassa-Samuelson effect. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. This effect is it's fundamental to understanding how real long-term currency appreciation happens.
Yeah.
In simple terms, it's the idea that as an economy gets real productivity gains in its tradable sectors, things like manufacturing, technology, anything you can sell abroad, it's able to sustain a stronger real exchange rate.
So if Ukrainian workers become, say, 20% more efficient at making a product, then workers elsewhere.
Then the Ukrainian economy is creating more value per hour of labor. And that increased value creation justifies a stronger currency, because that currency can now buy more, both at home and internationally. The hryvnia's strength becomes justified by the fact that the underlying economy is just fundamentally more productive.
But that seems so counterintuitive during a war when productive capacity is being destroyed daily. How can you even begin to leverage that effect?
It highlights the long-term vision that's required. While destruction is happening now, the planning has to focus on the post-war reconstruction as the moment to bake in these productivity gains. But even during the war, some sectors can thrive, like the IT sector. And this focus has to be paired with export diversification.
Why is getting away from just exporting raw commodities so critical for the currency?
Because a currency needs a steady, resilient stream of foreign earnings to be stable. If your economy relies too heavily on raw commodities, like iron or bulk grain, you're vulnerable to two huge risks.
Global price shocks.
Right, global commodity prices swing wildly. And the second is physical disruption. A mine or a port is a very easy target in a war. True resilience comes from moving up the value chain.
From selling raw grain to selling processed food products.
Exactly. Or moving from raw materials to advanced manufacturing or service exports like IT. These things generate a higher and more stable stream of foreign currency. That makes the hryvnia less vulnerable to external shocks. This is how you build strength on tangible value, not on speculation.
And the final lever here is lever C, de-dollarization. This is about persuading your own people to trust the hryvnia again.
Dollarization is the most visible symptom of deep public distrust. People hold dollars because they have a historical fear of inflation and bank failures. The only way to reverse that is not by banning dollars, but by making the hryvnia a more attractive choice.
So the main incentive is just offering attractive real interest rates.
That's the pull factor. Savers have to be confident that the interest they earn on their hryvnia deposits won't just be eaten up by inflation. If the real rate of return is consistently positive, so the interest rate is significantly higher than the inflation rate, then holding hryvnia becomes the rational, profitable choice.
But beyond just the rates, the sources also talk about building systemic trust. What does that mean for the financial system itself?
It means you need a well-capitalized banking system that people trust isn't going to collapse in the next crisis. It also means developing deep, liquid domestic bond markets.
Why is that so important?
Because it allows the government and large companies to borrow money locally, in hryvnia. This hugely reduces the systemic risk from foreign debt. If all your debt is in your own currency, a currency depreciation doesn't automatically trigger a default crisis. It makes the whole system more resilient and builds confidence in the hryvnia as the primary currency for finance.
The analogy they use is great here. Reducing dollarization isn't about banning off-road vehicles, the dollars. It's about paving the roads, stabilizing inflation, and upgrading the bus fleet, strengthening your banks and bond markets.
It's perfect. When the local financial system, the bus fleet, is cheaper, faster, more reliable, and offers a better return than holding cash under your mattress, people switch. It's a rational choice based on good stewardship. The hryvnia then becomes a legitimate store of value, backed by the choices of its own people.
So we've laid out this logical path of stabilization and reform, but we can't forget the giant reality hanging over all of this. The sources are explicit. The ongoing conflict is the dominant binding constraint. It complicates and often just frustrates every single policy decision we've discussed.
The war introduces a layer of risk that, frankly, conventional economic models really struggle with. It creates this massive, war-driven risk premium that can break the standard market mechanisms.
Let's talk about that risk premium. Normally, monetary theory says if you raise interest rates, you should attract capital. But the sources point out the ineffectiveness of rate hikes when the risk is war itself. Why is that?
Because the risk premium that extra return investors demand for holding assets in a dangerous place can get so large that it completely offsets the attractive returns from high interest rates.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine the MBU is offering a 20% interest rate on a government bond. On paper, that looks fantastic. But if the market perceives, say, a 30% chance that the country could face a strategic setback, or that the government might have to default, or that capital controls will trap their money, well, that risk of a catastrophic loss just completely negates the 20% return.
So the fear of total loss trumps the promise of high returns. You can turn up the interest rate tap as high as you want, but the risk premium is like a giant hole in the bottom of the bucket.
That's the practical reality. Your standard monetary tools become blunt instruments. And the sheer uncertainty of the conflict also dramatically shortens the planning horizons for everyone. investors, firms, even regular households.
And how does that affect the payoff from those crucial long-term reforms we were just talking about?
It creates a vicious cycle. Why would a foreign company invest hundreds of millions in a new factory that takes years to build if they fear it could be destroyed by a missile? It stifles the very foreign direct investment, the FDI, that you need for those Balassa Samuelson productivity gains.
It also must dampen the political will to push those hard reforms, like property
Of
rights.
course, because the payoff from those reforms feels very distant and uncertain, while the political cost of fighting entrenched interests is very real and immediate. The war short-circuits the long-term thinking needed for deep reform.
The house insurance analogy feels very apt here. The war is like having your house located in a permanent flood zone. It doesn't matter how great the plumbing or the wiring is inside. The insurance premium is going to be sky high because the external environment is fundamentally dangerous.
And that dangerous environment also creates severe constraints on supply and inflation control that monetary policy is powerless.
But the war is actively destroying the economy's ability to produce.
That is the critical distinction.
Yeah.
You have the physical destruction of factories, of logistics, of infrastructure. Bridges are down, ports are blocked. This creates real physical shortages of goods and services. The inflation that comes from that is a supply-side constraint.
And you can't fix a shortage of steel or fuel by raising interest rates.
No. The problem isn't that people are demanding too much. It's that there simply isn't enough to sell or move around efficiently. And this problem is compounded by the tragedy of human capital flight.
The brain drain.
Yes. The continued emigration of skilled workers, professionals, families. It's a huge long-term drag on the economy. It shrinks your future workforce, it slows your potential growth, and it erodes your tax base. A shrinking economy cannot support a strong currency in the long run, no matter how good the central bank is today.
Let's go back to that powerful analogy the sources use for this situation. The central bank is trying to cool a room that's controlling inflation, using the air conditioner interest rates.
Right. But the supply destruction from the war is like having all the windows smashed open. Heat is just rushing in from the outside because your productive capacity is gone. And if the government were to resort to fiscal dominance, that's like having a bonfire burning in the middle of the room. The air conditioner is rendered almost useless when the sources of heat are so powerful and outside of its control.
And finally, we have to touch on the risk that comes from the dependency constraint. The hryvnia's stability right now is heavily underwritten by that flow of external aid.
This reliance introduces a massive vulnerability, and it's a political one, not an economic one. The currency is directly exposed to the risk of support fatigue or political shifts in donor countries.
So if there's an election in a partner country or a budget fight and the aid gets delayed,
The market will immediately anticipate a funding gap. That anticipation would force the Ukrainian government to look for alternatives. And if the non-inflationary options are exhausted, the only one left is printing money. The mere fear of that could trigger devaluation pressure. It means the currency's stability is, in part, being decided in foreign capitals, which limits the NBU's autonomy. So given all these intense constraints, the war, the politics, the supply issues, the source material argues very strongly that the policy path has to be gradualist, and it has to follow a specific non-negotiable sequence.
the order matters.
The order's everything. It's path-dependent. Getting it wrong can be disastrous and lead you right back into a crisis.
Okay, so let's review that optimal sequencing, moving from survival to sustainability.
It's essentially three phases. Phase one is crisis containment. That's the tourniquet stage we talked about. Fixed rate, FX controls, and establishing that basic macroeconomic foundation of fiscal and monetary discipline. Pure survival.
Then phase two.
Phase two is the structural reform. This is the hard political slog of cleaning up institutions and boosting productivity. This is building the real economic muscle.
And only then can you move to the final phase.
Only then. Phase three is gradual liberalization. This is where you slowly loosen the FX controls and move towards a managed float, letting the market start to work again.
The sources really hammer home the danger of jumping to phase three too soon. What happens if a country opens its capital account or abandons the peg before phase two is done?
You risk immediate, massive capital flight and a new crisis. Liberalization without having robust, well-capitalized banks and without having inflation expectations firmly anchored is just, it's inviting disaster.
Because if people still don't trust the institutions or fear inflation, the second you let them, they'll move their money out.
They will. They'll convert their hryvnia into dollars and exit the system. You simply cannot open the gates until you are sure the foundation is solid enough to support the currency's value. Premature liberalization would just throw away all the hard-won gains from phase one.
So the central move in this whole process is what's called the anchor transition. This is the shift away from the external anchor, the fixed exchange rate, to an internal one, inflation targeting. When is that shift appropriate, and how does that new system work?
It's only appropriate once you've achieved that stability. Once inflation expectations are low and stable, and you have enough foreign reserves to handle some volatility. In this new system, you abandon the fixed rate for a managed float.
Meaning the exchange rate can move around?
It's allowed to fluctuate. It acts as a shock absorber. So when an external shock hits, the exchange rate can go up or down, and that insulates the domestic economy a bit. The NBU stops defending a specific number of hryvnia to the dollar.
And instead, it defends what?
It defends a specific target for domestic inflation, say 5% per year. The central bank then uses its tools, mostly interest rates, not to manage the dollar price, but to keep domestic prices stable, to keep them near that explicit target. The whole focus shifts inward.
That's a huge philosophical shift. It sounds like it relies completely on credibility.
That's it. The credibility of the central bank becomes the anchor for the entire system. The market, businesses, households, everyone has to believe that the NBU is willing and able to control inflation, even if it means making unpopular decisions like hiking interest rates in a way that slows down the economy. If that trust is lost, the whole system breaks down.
It's the difference between tying your boat to a dock, that's the fixed regime. It feels stable, but if the rope snaps, it's a catastrophe.
Right, versus a modern ship that uses a gyroscopic stabilizer. That's the inflation targeting regime. The ship is moving freely on the waves, but its internal discipline system is keeping it balanced.
So it's a difference between external constraint and internal control. The fixed rate is easy to understand, but it's brittle. The managed float is messier day to day, but it's more resilient as long as the central bank maintains that crucial credibility.
It's a powerful picture of the long road from just surviving a crisis to creating a fundamentally more robust and trustworthy system. Hashtag outro. When you synthesize all of this, the central finding is just inescapable. Sustainable hryvnia strength requires this synchronized strategy across governance, finance, and productivity. A currency's health is really just a summary reflection of the national economy's integrity and its trustworthiness. That strength depends on getting stabilization through fiscal discipline and low inflation. It depends on achieving real structural reform by establishing the rule of law and boosting productivity. And it depends on having predictable external support through financing and security guarantees.
You can't just pick one.
You can't. Each element reinforces the others. To get genuine, lasting strength, you can't have one without the others. The currency's value is, in the end, the summary expression of the nation's diligent stewardship of its economic life. Yet we've seen that strengthening the hryvnia requires this painstaking fiscal discipline, a rejection of short-term political temptations, and the building of reliable institutions. Now, economists often describe this as a purely technical process, managing reserves and interest rates. But when you look at the requirements for sound money honesty in the accounts, diligent stewardship of resources, predictable and ordered governance, they really start to mirror the very virtues that should guide a nation's stewardship of its affairs and its people.
Yeah.
So when we look at the immense political pressure to inflate debts away, to seek that temporary financial relief, it raises a challenging question for you, the listener. Are the hardest reforms Ukraine faces fundamentally economic and technical, just requiring expertise? Or are they, at their very core, tests of institutional character and moral discipline?
Food for thought indeed. And a reminder that economic stability is rarely separable from the moral and political architecture of a society. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the constraints and choices facing the Ukrainian hryvnia.